Picture this. You're standing in the opulent halls of Versailles in 1700, surrounded by glittering chandeliers and portraits of kings whose bloodlines stretch back centuries. The marble floors gleam beneath your feet, and the air is thick with perfume and whispered gossip. But as you look closer at those painted faces staring down from gilded frames, something unsettling begins to emerge. The same narrow chin appears again and again. The distinctive Habsburg jaw juts forward in portrait after portrait. Those pale, bulging eyes seem to follow you from canvas to canvas, not because of artistic skill, but because they're literally the same eyes, passed down through generations of marriages between cousins, uncles and nieces, brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law. What you're witnessing isn't just royal portraiture, it's the visual documentation of one of history's most systematic experiments in genetic catastrophe. For over 300 years, European royal families engaged in a practice so destructive that it would eventually topple dynasties, end bloodlines, and create human beings so physically and mentally compromised that they could barely function as people, let alone rulers of empires. Before diving into these forgotten stories of genetic horror and dynastic collapse, if you enjoy learning about the dark secrets history tried to bury, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these disturbing historical truths together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the shadows behind the crown. The practice that would ultimately destroy Europe's most powerful families began with what seemed like brilliant political strategy. Marriage was the ultimate diplomatic tool, a way to forge alliances, prevent wars, and consolidate power across vast territories. When King Ferdinand of Aragon married Queen Isabella of Castile in 1469, they weren't just uniting their hearts, they were creating modern Spain. When Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York, he was ending the Wars of the Roses and founding a dynasty that would rule England for over a century. But somewhere along the way, this practical approach to marriage became something far more sinister. Royal families became obsessed not just with political advantage, but with keeping their bloodlines pure. They convinced themselves that royal blood was fundamentally different from common blood, that it carried divine qualities that would be diluted or contaminated by mixing with lesser lineages. This belief would prove to be one of the most catastrophic delusions in human history. The House of Habsburg perfected this system of genetic isolation with scientific precision. They didn't just accidentally marry within their family, they systematically planned it, generation after generation, creating a web of relationships so complex that children might have the same person as both great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather through multiple different lineages. They developed what modern geneticists would recognize as the world's first controlled breeding program for humans, designed not to enhance desirable traits, but to preserve what they mistakenly believed was genetic superiority. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, was himself the product of cousin marriage, but his genetic damage was relatively mild compared to what would come later. He possessed the characteristic Habsburg features: the protruding lower jaw, the thick lower lip, the receding chin, but he was still functional as a ruler and a human being. He could eat, speak clearly, and make rational decisions. What he couldn't do was recognize that his family's marriage practices were creating a genetic time bomb that would detonate with increasing violence in each successive generation. Charles V's son, Philip II of Spain, married 4 times, but his most consequential marriage was to his niece, Anna of Austria. This wasn't a marriage born of passion or even political necessity. Anna was already allied to the Spanish cause through her father, who was Philip's own brother. This was a marriage designed purely to keep Habsburg blood concentrated, to ensure that the next generation would be even more purely Habsburg than the last. The children produced by this union began to show more severe signs of genetic damage. Don Carlos, Philip II's son and heir, was born with a severely deformed body and an unstable mind that made him unfit to rule the most powerful empire in the world. His skull was malformed, causing chronic headaches and erratic behavior. His spine was twisted, leaving him hunched and in constant pain. His jaw was so deformed that he could barely speak intelligibly. Yet this was the man destined to inherit control of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast territories in the Americas. But the Habsburg genetic experiment was just beginning. Each generation doubled down on the previous generation's mistakes, creating an acceleration of genetic damage that would have been impossible to predict, but was inevitable given their breeding practices. They were conducting an experiment in human genetics without understanding genetics, guided only by the arrogant belief that their blood was sacred and must be preserved at any cost. The mathematics of their inbreeding were staggering. While normal human beings share roughly 50% of their genes with their siblings and 25% with their cousins, the later Habsburgs shared genetic material at levels approaching those of siblings even when they were supposedly more distantly related. Their family tree didn't branch. It formed a twisted circle where the same genetic material was recycled over and over, concentrating both desirable and undesirable traits to dangerous levels. Philip III of Spain, grandson of Philip II, continued the family tradition by marrying his cousin Margaret of Austria. By this point, the Habsburg gene pool had become so concentrated that Margaret and Philip shared great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and multiple other ancestors through various lines of descent. Their children would be born with genetic material so similar to their own that the usual mechanisms of genetic diversity had essentially ceased to function. The physical manifestations of this genetic concentration became increasingly severe with each generation. The Habsburg jaw, initially just a distinctive family trait, evolved into a deformity so extreme that affected individuals could barely eat solid food. The characteristic Habsburg lip grew so pronounced that it interfered with speech and breathing. But these visible deformities were just the surface manifestations of genetic damage that went much deeper. Mental instability began to run through Habsburg bloodlines like a genetic plague. What had once been occasional eccentricity became systematic madness, affecting not just individual family members, but entire generations. The same genetic mechanisms that were supposed to preserve royal superiority were instead creating rulers who were paranoid, delusional, and increasingly incapable of rational thought. The Spanish branch of the Habsburg family was particularly affected, perhaps because they were the most systematic in their approach to cousin marriage. They created detailed genealogical charts not to avoid inbreeding, but to ensure it was carried out with maximum efficiency. They treated human reproduction like a mathematical equation, calculating which marriages would produce the most pure Habsburg offspring, without understanding that genetic purity was actually genetic catastrophe. Meanwhile, other royal families across Europe were conducting their own versions of this experiment. The French Bourbons, the English Stuarts, the Russian Romanovs, all of them believed that royal blood was too precious to be diluted by commoner genes. They created their own closed genetic systems, their own cycles of cousin marriage, their own accelerating spirals of genetic damage. But it was the Habsburgs who would ultimately pay the highest price for this systematic destruction of genetic diversity. By the late 1600s, their inbreeding had created something unprecedented in human history. A royal family so genetically compromised that they were producing children who were barely viable as human beings, let alone as rulers of vast empires. The final generation of Spanish Habsburgs would represent the ultimate expression of this genetic experiment. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, would be born so damaged by centuries of inbreeding that his very existence would become a testament to the catastrophic consequences of treating human beings like livestock to be bred for imaginary purity. Charles II of Spain entered the world in 1661 as the living embodiment of genetic catastrophe. His birth was not celebrated as the arrival of a future king, but mourned as the emergence of something that barely qualified as human. The infant who would inherit the throne of the most powerful empire on earth was so physically compromised that palace physicians initially doubted he would survive his first week of life. The child's appearance shocked even the hardened courtiers who had grown accustomed to Habsburg deformities. His head was grotesquely enlarged, covered with patches of sparse hair that grew in random directions. His tongue was so swollen and deformed that it protruded from his mouth constantly, making coherent speech impossible and causing him to drool uncontrollably. The famous Habsburg jaw had evolved into something monstrous. His lower jaw jutted forward so dramatically that his teeth couldn't meet, making chewing solid food an impossibility. But Charles's physical deformities were just the visible symptoms of genetic damage that penetrated every aspect of his being. His legs were so weak and malformed that he couldn't walk until he was 4 years old, and even then, only with the support of specially designed braces. His arms trembled constantly, making it impossible for him to hold objects or perform even the simplest tasks that children master in infancy. Palace servants had to feed him liquid meals because his jaw deformities made normal eating impossible. The Spanish court tried desperately to hide the extent of their king's disabilities, but Charles's condition made normal royal functions impossible. He couldn't deliver speeches because his tongue deformities made his words unintelligible. He couldn't participate in ceremonies because his physical weakness made standing for extended periods dangerous. He couldn't sign documents because his trembling hands couldn't control a pen with sufficient precision. What made Charles's situation even more tragic was that he seemed to possess enough mental capacity to understand his own limitations. Palace observers noted that he would sometimes stare at portraits of his ancestors with an expression of profound sadness, as if recognizing that he was the final catastrophic product of their genetic experiment. He knew he was supposed to be a king, but his body and mind were so compromised that he could barely function as a human being. The genetic mathematics that had created Charles were staggering even by Habsburg standards. His parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, but their relationship was far more genetically complex than even that suggests. Through multiple lines of descent, Charles had inherited genetic material from the same ancestors repeatedly. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that typically seen in laboratory animals bred for genetic research. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree reveals that Charles II had the genetic diversity equivalent to the offspring of siblings. Every harmful recessive gene that had been carried hidden in Habsburg bloodlines for generations was now expressed in full force. The genetic mechanisms that normally protect against birth defects had been completely overwhelmed by centuries of systematic inbreeding. The Spanish Empire, at the height of its territorial extent, was now ruled by a man who couldn't speak coherently, couldn't walk without assistance, and suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as severe developmental disabilities. The empire that controlled vast territories in Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa was guided by decisions made by a king whose mental capacity was so limited that he couldn't understand basic concepts of governance or statecraft. Charles's attempts to produce an heir became a source of international fascination and horror. His first marriage, to Marie-Louise of Orléans, was arranged with desperate hope that introducing new genetic material might somehow overcome the accumulated damage of Habsburg inbreeding. But Charles's physical deformities made normal marital relations impossible, and no children resulted from the union. When Marie-Louise died suddenly in 1689, possibly from poison administered by those who blamed her for the lack of an heir, Charles was married again to Maria Anna of Neuburg. This second marriage was equally unsuccessful in producing offspring, not because of any failure on the Queen's part, but because Charles's genetic damage extended to reproductive systems so malformed that conception was physiologically impossible. The failure to produce an heir meant that the Spanish Habsburg line would die with Charles, but the genetic catastrophe he represented had implications far beyond dynastic succession. His very existence demonstrated what happened when human beings were treated as breeding stock rather than individuals, when political ambition overrode basic biological reality, when arrogance and ignorance combined to create systematic genetic destruction. Palace life during Charles's reign became a grotesque theatre where everyone pretended that the drooling, trembling figure on the throne was actually capable of ruling an empire. Courtiers developed elaborate protocols for interpreting his unintelligible utterances as royal commands. Ministers learned to present him with decisions that required only simple yes or no responses, communicated through crude gestures since verbal communication was impossible. The international implications of having such a compromised ruler were enormous. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments that the Spanish king was essentially a living corpse, incapable of rational thought or decision-making. Enemy nations began planning for the inevitable succession crisis that would follow Charles's death, knowing that his incapacity made Spanish resistance to territorial challenges increasingly unlikely. But Charles II was not the only victim of royal inbreeding during this period. Across Europe, other dynasties were producing their own genetic catastrophes, their own living testimonies to the consequences of treating bloodline purity as more important than human welfare. The pattern was repeating itself in royal courts from London to St. Petersburg. Each family convinced that their particular version of cousin marriage was somehow different, somehow safer, somehow blessed by divine approval. The House of Stuart in England was conducting its own experiment in genetic concentration, producing rulers whose mental instability would eventually cost them their throne. The Bourbon family in France was creating their own cycle of inbreeding that would contribute to the weakness and indecision that made the French Revolution possible. The Romanovs in Russia were building genetic problems that would plague their dynasty for centuries, culminating in children so haemophiliac that minor cuts could prove fatal. Each royal family convinced themselves that their situation was unique, that their bloodline was special enough to transcend the biological laws that governed lesser mortals. But genetics doesn't respect crowns or divine right. The same mechanisms that were destroying the Habsburgs were quietly working their devastating effects in palaces across the continent, creating a generation of rulers whose genetic damage would reshape the political landscape of Europe. The Bourbon dynasty in France provides another chilling example of how systematic inbreeding could destroy even the most powerful royal houses. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, was the product of cousin marriage, though his genetic damage was relatively mild compared to what would follow. His son, the Grand Dauphin, married his cousin Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria, continuing the cycle that would eventually produce some of the most genetically compromised rulers in French history. By the time Louis ascended heir to the throne, the accumulated effects of Bourbon inbreeding were becoming apparent. Known as Louis the Beloved, he suffered from severe depression, paranoia, and episodes of what court physicians described as melancholic madness. His decision-making became increasingly erratic as he aged, swinging between periods of religious mania and complete withdrawal from royal duties. Modern historians studying his behavior patterns recognize classic symptoms of genetic mental illness exacerbated by generations of cousin marriage. But it was Louis XV's heir, the future Louis XVI, who would pay the ultimate price for his family's genetic practices. Born to parents who shared multiple sets of ancestors, Louis XVI inherited not just the throne of France, but also a constellation of genetic problems that would make him spectacularly unsuited for the challenges his reign would face. His physical appearance was distinctly abnormal. He was grotesquely overweight despite palace attempts to control his diet, suffered from severe social anxiety that made public appearances torturous, and displayed the kind of indecisiveness that suggested underlying neurological damage. The tragic irony is that Louis XVI's genetic problems directly contributed to the French Revolution. His inability to make decisive decisions during crucial moments, his tendency to withdraw from conflict rather than confront it, and his apparent disconnection from political reality were not just personal failings. They were the direct result of centuries of Bourbon inbreeding. The same genetic practices that were supposed to preserve royal authority instead created a king so compromised that he couldn't preserve his own life, let alone his dynasty. Meanwhile, in England, the House of Stuart was conducting its own catastrophic experiment in bloodline concentration. The marriage between James II and Mary of Modena represented another instance of cousin marriage designed to preserve Catholic succession, but the genetic consequences were severe. Their son, James Francis Edward Stuart, known to history as the Old Pretender, suffered from chronic health problems that made his various attempts to reclaim the English throne physically impossible. The Stuart genetic legacy became even more concentrated in the next generation. Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender, was born to parents who shared so many ancestors that his coefficient of inbreeding rivaled that of laboratory animals. His famous charm and charisma masked severe psychological problems, violent mood swings, alcoholism, and increasingly erratic behavior that alienated potential supporters and doomed his cause. The Battle of Culloden in 1746 wasn't just a military defeat for the Jacobite cause, it was the final demonstration that genetic damage had made the Stuart line unfit to rule. Charles Edward's decisions during the campaign showed a level of strategic incompetence that went beyond mere inexperience. His inability to maintain alliances, his tendency toward paranoid accusations against his own supporters, and his complete collapse into alcoholism following defeat were all symptoms of genetic problems that had been building in Stuart bloodlines for generations. These royal families believed they were preserving something sacred through their systematic inbreeding, but they were actually conducting the largest genetic experiment in human history. From the drooling Habsburg king who couldn't speak to the French monarchs, whose indecision helped topple their own dynasty, these bloodlines destroyed themselves in pursuit of imaginary purity. Their crumbling empires and extinct dynasties stand as monuments to the catastrophic consequences of treating human beings like breeding stock. The crowns may have been made of gold, but the bloodlines beneath them had turned to poison.